So the important issue perhaps for us is not to always ask the question, are we seeing fruits on our labor, but are we staying faithful to what God has called us to do, and are we bravely continuing in what He has asked us to do despite resistance and challenges around us? John, the courageous prophet, his story comes to a terrible end, and it is a reminder to us that service to God, faithfulness to the Lord, can have a price. Hopefully for me and you, not as high as in this case, but somewhere along the line, you probably have been, and we will again be challenged regarding our discipleship and what it asks from us. It's true in general, but especially true when we listen to God's calling in our life of making known what the Lord says and proclaiming His word. And even more so when our calling brings us into conflict with the powers of this world. Like someone said, leaders are comfortable with religion. Leaders like religion when it keeps people calm. And if they can control their subjects through religion. But when faithful people speak out against their leaders, the pressure quickly comes on. A big example of this in this century already, or previous century, was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Some of you may have heard of him. He was opposed to the Nazi regime, and he stuck his neck out and opposed them in many ways. And in the end, he was captured. He was put in one of the camps, and 5 days before the end of the war, he was executed. But his writings are still inspiring people. Amongst them, a book he wrote, The Cost of Discipleship. Some have said in this century they see Alexei Navalny as a person in this line. He was willing to stand up for freedom against President Putin, and he was put into jail, but he did that from a point of faith. And we will find many examples over years of people sticking to their calling of discipleship, even when it becomes clear there's a cost involved. It becomes even more poignant when you compare this story to the previous one. In the previous story of the disciples, we read of blessings on their ministry. It's going well. They are healing people. They're driving out demons. They have the privilege of seeing fruit on and how God is using what they're doing. But now we read a story where faithfulness to God leads to death. It looks, in first instance, as if there will be nothing to show for everything that John has done. So the important issue perhaps for us is not to always ask the question, are we seeing fruits on our labor, but are we staying faithful to what God has called us to do, and are we bravely continuing in what He has asked us to do despite resistance and challenges around us. But that being said, there is also even comfort in that. Because like I mentioned earlier, this story points forward to Jesus' death, own suffering and death. And at that time, Jesus' death on a cross looked as if it was the end. There was no fruit on His labor, no meaning in what He had done. It was the biggest failure of all time. People thought, well, there it all ends. And yet, God did His greatest work through that cross and the resurrection that followed. That which looked like a failure on the part of man was in fact a moment of triumph with wonderful positive effects. Our forgiveness of sins, our salvation, life with God everlasting, flowing from that moment that looked like a failure. So even in those times when it looks as if our service to the Lord is not bearing fruit, God can, in His greatness and in His time, use it to do something wonderful and surprising. The challenge to me and you, whatever we experience, is to remain faithful servants of Christ, whether we see the fruit or not.